Mid-February 1943. The North African desert was quiet in a way that only followed catastrophe. Burned vehicles still smoked in the distance, twisted metal half buried in sand. The wind carried the smell of fuel, cordite, and defeat. Near the Tunisian border, inside a hardened command post carved into rock and sandbags, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel sat alone at a narrow desk. Outside, the Afrika Korps was celebrating. Engines revved. Boots scraped against stone. Laughter echoed through the encampment. German soldiers believed they had just exposed a truth the world had been waiting to see. The Americans, the newcomers to this war, had been tested, and they had failed. Rommel did not share their excitement. He leaned forward under a dim lamp, pen moving slowly across paper, writing to his wife, Lucy. This was not a love letter. It was an assessment. Cold, precise, merciless. He wrote that the American forces he had just defeated were soft, that they lacked proper training, that their officers made mistakes so basic they would have been court-martialed in any European army. What Rommel had witnessed at Kasserine Pass was not merely a battlefield setback, it was a collapse. Entire American battalions had disintegrated under pressure. Some had surrendered without exhausting their ammunition. Others had fled in disorder, abandoning artillery, trucks, and tanks along desert roads. In less than a week, thousands of casualties. Positions lost, not inch by inch, but mile by mile. Rommel had seen this before. He had seen it in France, when a modern army folded in weeks. He had seen it in the early days of the Soviet campaign, when formations shattered faster than commanders could react. To Rommel, the Americans at Kasserine looked no different. Soldiers raised on stories of the First World War, of heroism, endurance, and sacrifice, now stood face to face with the reality of mechanized warfare. And many of them, Rommel believed, were not ready. In his islandry letter, he went further. He wrote that if Germany could strike again quickly, within weeks, the Americans could be driven into the sea before they learned how to fight properly. This was not speculation. It was a recommendation. That assessment did not remain private. It was shared with Berlin. The message was clear. Exploit American weakness immediately. Do not give them time. Do not allow them to adapt. Rommel's confidence was not rooted in arrogance. It was rooted in evidence. At Kasserine Pass, American forces had failed at every level that mattered. Units were scattered across terrain without mutual support. Commanders had positioned formations poorly, ignoring the fundamentals of defense in depth. Radio discipline collapsed as soon as German armor appeared. Messages overlapped, orders contradicted one another, and panic traveled faster than information. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery was nearly non-existent. When German panzer formations concentrated against weak sectors, American units pulled back without orders. One withdrawal triggered another, and soon entire lines were dissolving. At the center of this chaos stood the commander of the American Second Corps, Major General Lloyd Fredendall. His headquarters was not near the front. It was not even within sight of the battlefield. It was hidden deep inside a canyon, nearly 70 miles to the rear. Fredendall fought the battle through radio static and telephone wires, issuing orders without ever seeing the terrain or the men executing them. His instructions arrived late, often unclear, sometimes contradictory. German intelligence officers intercepted transmissions, recorded movements, and compiled detailed reports. Their conclusion was damning. American equipment was adequate. Their tanks were serviceable. Their artillery was powerful. Their soldiers fought bravely when cornered. The problem was command. This was an army learning how to fight while already at war. Learning against Germany's most experienced formations. Rommel calculated timelines the way others counted ammunition. He believed it would take the Americans at least 6 months to correct their leadership failures. A full year, perhaps more, to develop doctrine capable of standing against German operational art. If Germany attacked again before that transformation occurred, the outcome would be the same. German armored doctrine had not failed since the war began. It relied on principles refined through blood and repetition. Concentrate force at a decisive point. Break through with speed and violence. Exploit success with mobile units. Force the enemy into retreat or encirclement. This doctrine had crushed France. It had driven deep into the Soviet Union. It had repeatedly pushed British forces backward across North Africa. The reason it worked was simple. Most armies fought defensively. They tried to hold lines. German mobility bypassed those lines and destroyed cohesion. At Kasserine, the Americans had fought the same way. They dug in and waited. When German armor struck, they reacted instead of acting. Rommel saw no reason that would change. He studied maps spread across his desk. His finger traced ridgelines, valleys, and roads around a place called El Guetter in central Tunisia. The terrain was open, maneuverable, perfect for armor. If German forces attacked there in late March, American units would still be recovering from humiliation. Morale would be fragile. Confidence shattered. The psychological advantage alone could decide the battle. Berlin agreed. Another offensive, they believed, would finish the job. American forces would collapse. Germany could then shift attention back to the British, while the Americans quietly withdrew, their first great campaign ending in disgrace. Then, intelligence reports arrived that complicated everything. In early March 1943, the Americans changed commanders. On the 6th of March, Lieutenant General George Smith, Patton Jr. assumed command of the 2nd Corps, the same formation that had broken at Kasserine Pass. Patton's arrival did not go unnoticed. Before he spoke a word, before he issued a single order, the atmosphere changed. He arrived in a motorcade with sirens wailing across the desert. He stepped out wearing polished boots, crisp uniform, and his ivory-handled pistols displayed openly. This was not vanity. It was messaging. Patton did not believe morale could be repaired quietly. He believed it had to be shocked back into existence. He issued no speeches about forgiveness. He issued ultimatums. The era of excuses was over. Discipline returned immediately and without compromise. Soldiers were ordered to wear regulation helmets at all times, even under the desert sun. Officers were required to wear proper uniforms. Those who did not were fined publicly. Soldiers who failed to salute were corrected in front of their units. German observers dismissed these actions as cosmetic. 3. Weeks of discipline could not erase months of failure. One man could not teach doctrine to an entire corps in less than a month. Rommel agreed. Patton might restore order. He might stiffen morale. But transforming an army required time. Time the Americans did not have. Rommel's health was deteriorating. Chronic stomach pain gnawed at him. Fatigue weighed heavily. Yet his mind remained clear. Before relinquishing operational command in Tunisia to General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, Rommel reviewed the El Guetter plan one final time. Every assumption was logical. The Americans would defend passively. They would hesitate under pressure. They would retreat when armor broke through. 3 weeks would not be enough to change who they were. Late in March, German forces prepared to strike. They were confident. They believed the Americans were still broken. They were wrong. Late March 1943. The desert around El Guetter lay deceptively calm. a wide bowl of rock and sand, framed by low ridges and dry wadis. To an untrained eye, it looked empty. To German commanders studying their maps, it looked ideal. Open terrain, clear fields of fire, room for armor to maneuver and crush resistance the way it had so many times before. In the early hours before dawn on the 23rd of March, German units moved into position with quiet confidence. Engines were warmed. Crews checked weapons by touch rather than sight. Orders had been given the night before, brief and assured. This was expected to be a repeat performance, another demonstration of what happened when inexperienced armies met German operational art. The 10th Panzer Division formed the spearhead. Veteran crews sat inside their Mark V tanks, confident in steel, training, and doctrine. Alongside them, the Italian Centauro Division prepared to advance on the flank, tasked with exploiting any collapse once American resistance cracked. German commanders briefed their men on what they expected from the enemy. The Americans would defend from fixed positions. They would wait. They would call for air support that might not arrive. Under sustained pressure, they would fall back, just as they had at Kasserine Pass. Nothing in German intelligence suggested otherwise. As first light crept across the desert, the attack began. At 6 in the morning, the lead elements of the 10th Panzer rolled forward. Tracks bit into sand. Turrets scanned the horizon. The terrain was favorable. Visibility was clear. Everything matched the plan. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then, the ground exploded. American artillery did not announce itself with ranging shots. There was no gradual escalation. There was only impact. Dozens of shells arrived simultaneously, slamming into German formations with terrifying precision. The timing was exact. Batteries separated by miles fired as one, their rounds converging on the same coordinates at the same second. Time on target. For German crews, it felt unnatural. Shells did not walk forward. They appeared everywhere at once. Tanks were rocked by concussions. Infantry were thrown to the ground. Vehicles burned before drivers could react. German radio nets erupted. Medical evacuation requests flooded the airwaves. Commanders demanded reports. Forward observers shouted corrections that were no longer necessary. The Americans had already adjusted. This was not the artillery of an amateur army. German officers stared at their maps in disbelief. This level of coordination was something their own forces, still reliant on slower methods, could not easily replicate. The accuracy was shocking. The volume was overwhelming. Yet doctrine demanded persistence. Orders were issued to press forward. This resistance, commanders believed, would break once armor closed with American positions. The tanks advanced through the barrage. That was when the next surprise revealed itself. American tank destroyers opened fire from concealed positions, not from obvious defensive lines, but from carefully selected angles. German tanks began taking hits from the flanks. Armor that should have been dominant suddenly found itself exposed regardless of facing. The Americans had built crossfires into the terrain. German crews adjusted, maneuvering to bring guns to bear, only to draw fire from another direction. What should have been a straightforward armored thrust turned into a grinding advance under constant threat. By mid-morning, German units had penetrated several thousand yards into American positions. Under normal circumstances, this would have been the moment American lines collapsed. They did not. Instead of panicked withdrawals, German observers reported something unfamiliar. American units were falling back deliberately, moving to secondary positions that had already been prepared. They withdrew under covering fire, maintained formation, and resumed resistance almost immediately. This was not retreat. It was execution. For the men of the EE, American 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One. This fight carried a deeper meaning. These were the same soldiers who had fled at Kasserine, the same units that had been ridiculed, studied, and dismissed. Now, as German armor closed in, they did not look for escape routes. They checked sectors. They waited for commands. Fear was still present, but it was controlled, replaced by something colder. German radio intercepts captured American communications. The tone was calm. Orders were clear. Units reported positions with precision. Requests for fire support were concise and accurate. This was not the frantic, overlapping chatter German intelligence had recorded weeks earlier. American infantry held under direct fire until ordered to move. When they did withdraw, it was not to flee. It was to reposition. They occupied new ground and resumed fighting with the same intensity. On the German right flank, the Italian Centauro Division reported heavy resistance. American machine gun positions opened fire from overlapping fields, pinning infantry before they could close. Every attempt to advance was met with disciplined, coordinated counterfire. By midday, the German advance slowed. This was not supposed to happen. At German headquarters, reports arrived steadily, each one more troubling than the last. Casualties were rising. Objectives were not being reached. American resistance showed no signs of collapse. General Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, now commanding German forces in Tunisia, studied the incoming data with growing unease. The terrain had not changed. The equipment disparity remained. Yet the Americans were fighting as a system, not as scattered units. Something fundamental had shifted. The Shermans were still technically inferior. German guns could still destroy them at range, but German armor was no longer able to dictate the fight. Every advance triggered concentrated artillery. Every pause allowed American units to reposition and counter. What German doctrine relied on, momentum, was being denied. By the afternoon, it became clear that the offensive was bleeding strength without achieving a breakthrough. German commanders requested permission to disengage. Losses were no longer acceptable. The Americans were too strong in their current positions. The attack was suspended. German forces withdrew under cover, leaving behind damaged vehicles and wounded men. The desert that had seemed so open in the morning now felt hostile, watched, controlled. German intelligence moved quickly to understand what had gone wrong. Captured American soldiers were questioned. Documents recovered from abandoned positions were analyzed. There were no signs of new equipment, no evidence of massive reinforcements, no indication of long-term retraining. The answer was disturbing in its simplicity. The transformation had occurred in 21 days. Under Patton's command, the American Second Corps had been remade. The process was ruthless. First came the purge. Officers who hesitated were relieved without ceremony. Those who demonstrated aggression were promoted regardless of seniority. Leadership positions were given to men who acted decisively under pressure. Second came doctrine. American units were trained to counterattack immediately, not wait. Artillery learned to concentrate overwhelming fire at decisive points, rather than disperse it. Defense was redefined as active pressure, constant patrolling, and refusal to yield initiative. Third came psychology. Patton did not convince his soldiers they were superior through speeches. He convinced them through enforcement. Standards were absolute. Success was rewarded publicly. Failure was punished immediately. The lesson was simple and brutal. Attack succeeds. Hesitation fails. German analysts realized that American doctrine now neutralized German strengths. Concentrated armor no longer produced breakthroughs. Sustained pressure no longer caused collapse. What had once looked like technical superiority now became vulnerability under coordinated fire. The Americans were not trying to outmatch German tanks. They were making tanks irrelevant. For German infantry, it felt as though the sky itself had turned against them. Shells arrived without warning. Counterattacks struck before momentum could build. There was no pause to reorganize, no moment to breathe. This was not an army learning to fight. This was an army that had learned how to win. As German commanders reviewed the Battle of El Gueter, a realization began to settle in. The assumptions made after Kasserine Pass were no longer valid. The Americans they had mocked no longer existed. Somewhere in Germany, Rommel's earlier warnings resurfaced. He had written that the Americans learned faster than any opponent Germany had faced. At El Gueter, that warning had been proven correct. The question was no longer whether the Americans could fight. The question was how long Germany could survive against an enemy that adapted this quickly. And the answer was beginning to take shape in the sand of Tunisia. Early April 1943. The desert wind carried a different tone now. Not triumph, not confidence, uncertainty. German units that had once advanced with certainty now moved cautiously, scanning ridgelines that seemed alive with invisible guns. El Gueter had not been a defeat on paper, but everyone who had been there understood the truth. Something irreversible had occurred. For the first time in North Africa, German commanders were not asking how to exploit American weakness. They were asking how to survive American response. Reports from El Gueter circulated through headquarters in Tunisia, and then onward to Berlin. The language was careful, restrained, but the implications were alarming. American forces had not collapsed. They had absorbed pressure, countered aggressively, and denied momentum. Casualties had been inflicted at a rate that no longer favored Germany. This did not fit the old model. German intelligence officers worked methodically. They compared radio intercepts from Kasserine Pass with those from El Gueter. The difference was unmistakable. Where there had once been confusion, there was now clarity. Where there had been panic, there was now discipline. Where there had been hesitation, there was now immediate action. The Americans had not changed their weapons. They had changed their minds. Rommel was no longer in Africa when these conclusions fully crystallized. His health had finally forced a decision. Years of strain, chronic illness, and exhaustion had caught up with him. On the 9th of March, 1943, he flew back to Germany on medical leave, leaving behind a theater he would never command again. Before departing, he wrote revised assessments for the commanders who remained. The tone was markedly different from his February letters. Gone was the dismissive certainty. In its place was caution. He warned that American forces, under new leadership, were improving at a speed Germany had not encountered before. Any future operation against them, he wrote, should not assume collapse under pressure. They were adapting quickly. Those warnings were not fully absorbed. In Tunisia, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Allied pressure increased from all directions. British forces pressed from the east. American units, now aggressive and coordinated, pushed from the west. German and Italian formations were stretched thin, short on fuel, ammunition, and air support. What had once been a maneuver war became a battle of attrition Germany could not win. By mid-May 1943, the outcome was no longer in doubt. On the 13th of May, German and Italian forces in Tunisia surrendered. More than 250,000 Axis soldiers laid down their arms. It was one of the largest mass surrenders in German military history. North Africa was over. For American forces, the transformation was complete. In less than 3 months, they had gone from humiliation at Kasserine Pass to victory in Tunisia. German commanders took notice. They studied American performance and issued new tactical guidance to their own troops. They warned defenders to expect aggressive American attacks, rapid armored movement, artillery that could concentrate fire with frightening speed and accuracy. Static defense, they cautioned, would not hold. These were not theoretical warnings. When Allied forces landed in Sicily in mid-July 1943, those predictions proved accurate. American units under Patton's 7th Army advanced rapidly along the western coast. They did not pause. They did not wait for perfect conditions. They exploited every opening. Patton's forces reached Messina ahead of British formations, a race that shocked both allies and enemies. German defenders reported that American aggression, combined with overwhelming logistical support, made defensive operations nearly impossible. The image of the hesitant American soldier was gone. By the time the war moved to Western Europe, German assessments of American capability had been completely rewritten. In early June 1944, Rommel found himself once again facing the Americans, this time from the opposite side of the continent. He now commanded German forces tasked with defending France against the expected Allied invasion. Rommel's defensive doctrine reflected hard-earned lessons. He positioned mobile reserves close to likely landing zones. He understood that Americans would push inland immediately after landing. The key, he believed, was to counterattack before they could establish momentum. His assessment of American forces had evolved completely from the man who had written dismissive letters in February 1943. He now wrote that Americans combined material superiority with aggressive doctrine more effectively than the British. Static defense, he warned, would fail against them. When? The invasion came in early June 1944. Rommel's preparations were undermined not by faulty analysis, but by interference from above. Panzer reserves were held back by higher authority. Opportunities for immediate counterattack were lost. Yet Rommel's understanding proved accurate. At Utah and Omaha beaches, American forces pushed inland despite heavy casualties. They did not pause. They did not wait for perfection. They forced the battle forward. Other German generals were still adjusting. Rommel had already learned. After Germany's surrender, Allied interrogators questioned senior German officers about their experiences fighting American forces. The testimony was strikingly consistent. It carried an undertone of reluctant respect. They had expected the Americans to be like the French, or like the early Soviet armies, slow to learn, easy to demoralize. Instead, they encountered an opponent that evolved at a pace that felt almost unfair. One German panzer commander stated that Americans learned faster than any army Germany had faced. Weaknesses identified in battle were corrected within weeks, not months. Another senior officer testified that American artillery coordination was the most effective he had seen in 6 years of war. The speed with which Americans could concentrate fire rendered traditional German tactics obsolete. What disturbed German professionals most was not American equipment. The Soviets had excellent tanks. The British had experienced troops. The Americans combined material advantage with doctrine. They turned resources into results. By the final year of the war, German commanders agreed on one thing. The American Army of 1945 bore no resemblance to the force that had collapsed at Kasserine Pass. It had become one of the most effective fighting machines in history. They did not just lose the war. They lost their belief in their own superiority. Rommel's original assessment after Kasserine Pass had been logical. Based on every precedent Germany had known, armies required years to mature. Officers needed prolonged combat exposure. Doctrine evolved slowly through trial and error. Patton shattered that assumption in 3 weeks. The change revealed itself at El Guetar. The next 2 months proved it was permanent. By the time Tunisia fell in May 1943, German commanders understood that American improvement was not temporary. Leadership mattered more than experience. Doctrine mattered more than equipment. Aggressive mindset mattered more than technical superiority. Germany built better tanks. America built better doctrine. When the two met at El Gueter, doctrine won. It won again in Sicily. It won in Normandy. It won across France and into Germany itself. The 90 days between the shame of Kasserine Pass and the triumph in Tunisia changed the course of the war. It was the moment the arsenal of democracy found its sword. From that point forward, German generals stopped underestimating American soldiers. Because by the spring of 1943, they understood the truth. The man across the foxhole was no longer a tourist in uniform. He was the architect of their inevitable defeat.